Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's both, I guess, book launch and lecture and conversation to celebrate the launch of Spatial Infrastructure, a new book by José Aragüez, which we're really delighted to host here at the AA, and that you can buy a copy of in the back of the room if you haven't already. So it's really special to be able to host this conversation here because we hosted the launch of José's last book, The Building, around 5 years ago. But even the book itself, The Building, came out of a conversation that José organized here back in 2014. So this kind of project of books and conversations and how they shape each other is something that's like kind of deeply embedded in this room and at the AA. And so it feels like tonight will be the beginning of maybe a new project, as well as celebrating what's a really fascinating book. I don't really want to say more than that because José is going to tell us all about the book and then be followed by an amazing conversation with Sophia, Sarah, James Kamsey, and Anna Font. So I will hand over to you without any further ado, but thank you very much for joining us here tonight.
Thank you, Manije, for the introduction and for your help to organize this event, as usual. Wonderful to work with you. And great to be back, indeed, at the AA. To speak about, indeed, my second book, Spatial Infrastructure, which is a collection of essays that I've written over the past 15 years, approximately, so since the beginning of my career as an architect and a writer. So 8 essays and an introduction in and around the question of architectural thinking as a form of knowledge, where architectural thinking refers to basically the repository of discursive knowledge engendered through the discussion, analysis, and conceptualization of aspects of two inextricably imbricated regimes, the regime of the building on the one hand, and then the regime of the design process leading up to the building, right? So what can it do? What can architectural thinking do? How can we push its boundaries? How can we characterize 21st century architectural thinking as opposed to 20th century architectural thinking or 19th century architectural thinking? Those are the kinds of questions that I'm interested in this particular work. And I propose 2 ways to deal with those questions that were already articulated in my previous project. The manager mentioned briefly The Building. Some of you may be familiar with. This was a larger discursive project in which the book was basically the main manifestation. A book that proposed 60 new terms, also around architectural thinking. As I say, a larger discursive project that took about 6 years to complete, but the very first instantiation of the whole thing actually happened here at the AA, so I couldn't resist putting in a picture of that. That's 2014, with a lot of amazing people that at the time basically made up the core of history and theory, but also student instructors at the time, and also some people who came from the AA, and sorry, from the US. So after that one, the whole project generated 23 events across the US and Europe. And we gathered many, I mean, pretty much all of the top people in the history theory world, primarily in the Anglo-American scene, but also elsewhere, as well as practitioners with, let's say, intellectual inklings. And indeed, that was one of the main purposes of that project, as it is for this project, that is to say, to resist what we can call the kind of growing estrangement between history and theory on the one hand, and design practice on the other hand. So by the end of 2019, we got to that 60-40 percentage between history theory people and design practice people. So a lot of folks now, of course, are asking, okay, so what's the rapport between the building and this new project? So there's a number of links there, but one of them is, as I said earlier, the 2 ways that I suggest dealing with the question of architectural thinking as a form of knowledge. On the one hand, the possibility of engaging with the outside of the discipline of architecture, but to do so through architectural specificity. that is to say, to propose discursive endeavors that do not leave architectural thinking behind, actually, but use it as a way to engage with questions outside of the field. Let's say in the tradition of people like Robin Evans, for example, or Alan Colquhoun, or Kenneth Frampton, or more recently Stan Allen. And then, on the other hand, target the field itself, the field of architecture itself, by setting out to make contributions to architectural thinking as such. So, in this book, Spatial Infrastructure, there are 2 essays attempting to do the former and 6 essays that do the latter, with one of them doing a little bit of both. So in the building's discursive building, I'm going to run quickly through these essays to focus on one of them at the end. In this one, the main question is basically what are the architectural equivalents to these other systems of thought that exerted a major influence outside of the disciplinary boundaries where they originated, right? Such as Freudian psychoanalysis, Frankfurt School dialectics, or Derridian deconstruction, right? So system of thought born out of the study of the psyche, the human psyche, system of thought born in epistemology in particular, and system of thought that started with the study of semiology originally, right? And then they managed to have a major impact outside of their original fields, right? So what's the architectural equivalent of that? And even beyond that, has architecture actually been able to produce a system of thought in the strict sense of the term, right? A discursive, fully fledged, comprehensive system of thought. On architectural metacriticality here, I propose the term critical constructionism as a critical attitude that seeks to assemble and construct a parallel regime of reality that's critical, as opposed to seeking to debunk the reality that we are trying to analyze, right? So in other words, to try to mobilize architecture to stabilizing power, to re-articulate external domains of signification and experience, and more ambitiously to breed new knowledge of contemporary socio-cultural dynamics, as opposed to just adjust to them or translate them into architecture's code, which has been, in my opinion, a much more common trend over the last 60 to 50 years. So, as I said, essays engaging with the outside through architecture specificity, and then essays that target architecture thinking more specifically, or as I suggested in the building's discursive building once again, to try and articulate what it means for one building to embody a significant contribution to the history of architecture in terms of one particular design aspect or several design aspects, one building element, one expressive format, or a concept relevant to the analysis and reading of works in general, right? So that's relatively easy to articulate like that. I don't think that's that easy, but relatively doable. What's a lot harder is to actually find works of architecture that actually achieve that. It's just a tiny percentage of everything that's been conceived and built in the history of architecture. So the goal is to try to cope with that question. And to do so, I'm going to run through 5 of the 8 essays that look at a number of case studies and both historical and contemporary conditions, going from the broader to the more specific, right? So starting with the broader approach, into our critique of the organic in architectural thinking, the idea is that if you look at the notion of the organic philosophically, and I think we have to do that because the concept of the organic actually is philosophical way before it intersected architecture. And if you do that, you realize that the organic has little to do with the way it has been employed in architecture often, which has involved a series of cliches having to do with biological metaphors, with formal analogies, with mimicry of the living world, that kind of thing. While actually the implications of the organic precede notions of shape and conditions of shape, and have to do with procedural logics, with the way a whole is constituted, that is to say, with relational properties between parts, with the fact that those parts had to add up to something more than just the parts themselves. I mean, there's a series of issues connected to the notion of the organic that exceed visual conditions and conditions regarding aesthetic, and as I said, mimicry of the living world. So what if Mies van der Rohe's Seagram building in New York is actually an organic, the paradigm of an organic work of architecture, which is the very opposite of the way it's tend to be considered, right? And you extend that kind of thinking across the board, that basically allows you a rethinking of all of the 20th century architectural movements. Here in patenting arrangement, I look at the painfully under-researched domain of patents. Some of you out there is trying to find something to work on. There's a lot of work to do on patents, or patent here in the US, not to say, here in the UK, patent you say. So I looked at patents, and in particular, I do so in engineering, not in architecture, to discover that basically engineering has dealt with form in a very one-sided way, right? And things having to do with materiality, constructability, with shed-like spaces, long spans, certain fascination with technology. But there is another side involving spatial organization that the history of engineering has neglected quite substantially. And so through that, through the analysis of patterns, you see that, and further, you see that basically there's a niche of opportunity for the kind of scientific thinking that's constitutive of engineering to unleash all of its potential to facilitate the conception of models of spatial organization in architecture, right? So even if we speak about science or engineering, at the end of the day, via that detour, you end up arriving at a big contribution, I believe, in architecture specifically. Here in critical imageability, imageability is a term that crops up relatively little, I think, in the history of architecture as well, and it speaks to the condition of buildings to become images that travel and are represented in such a way that they can resonate, or that they do resonate with the faculties of the subject's mind in some important ways. And here the idea is that the development of strategies, design strategies, resonating with the notion or relevant to imageability over the last 25, 30 years, actually bears the imprint of exceeding the sphere of signification alone. And so I try to kind of demonstrate that in the essay, and to argue for, in fact, conceiving spatial organization through protocols of representation, right? As a way to, let's say, turn the constant demands on architecture's imageability, on the imageability of buildings, to our disciplinary advantage. Let's put it that way. So I'm showing here just a few buildings that I discuss in that essay, where you have basically an inextricable link between the imageable character of the building and its interior organization. So for example, here, I cannot dwell too much on these essays because, as I said, I'm going to focus on one particular a little bit later. But here, there's a metaphor of the flower that's usually evoked to talk about the Marina City project in Chicago. And in fact, there's a relationship between that metaphor and the fact that the apartments are arranged radially within the building as if they were petals or something, right? So there is basically a seamless transition between the domain of signification on the one hand, and then the domain of spatial organization on the other hand, or as Frampton would put it, the representational domain of architecture and the ontological domains of architecture, right? So that happens very, very little in general in the history of architecture as well, where the notion of lobotomy, for example, if one uses Koolhaas's term, is way more often where there's this clear separation between the two domains. Here, self-determinacy via disciplinary diversification. I look at the work of basically the student output at the Cooper Union School of Architecture between 64 and 85, so the first period of John Haydock's leadership at the school, to see whether the singularity that was written into the teaching design methods at that school actually was lived up to by the work itself, right? And then beyond that, whether the potential for that singularity to have an impact on the status quo of architecture, even outside of the academic domain, actually fulfilled that potential around New York specifically. And so this is a very particular school, the Cooper Union, often compared to the AA here because of its independence and its kind of particular ideology, especially under Haydak's leadership, although there are major differences between the two schools, I believe, but there's a kind of independence that attracted my attention here to look at the work a little bit in depth. And finally, so as I said, I'm going to from the broader to more specific. Eventually, I basically take up the same challenge I gave to the contributors of the building, so to focus just on one single building. In this case, I looked at Toyo Ito's Taichung Opera House, finished in 2016, and basically set out to delineate a new design understanding out of it that could potentially overcome, let's say, the duality of modernism versus postmodernism, and to give rise as a kind of to a kind of design understanding centered around buildings that are at once counterintuitively simple and yet intricate in their appearance. So, in other words, actually complex as opposed to complicated. So that we can imagine new spatial arrangements, right? So there's no precedent for, on the right hand you have Taichung, on the left hand you have the precedent to Taichung by Ito himself and Andrea Branzi of Archizum that they lost as a competition entry in 2004, and that's a cultural building for Ghent in Belgium. There's literally no precedent for that building in the history of architecture, for the left one. There's no building like that done before, which is the extremely hard thing to do. The precedent for that is actually in the world of geometry, but not in the domain of architecture. So, to me, the most central observation that starts to emerge from those 5 essays is that there is a connection, there's a correspondence between turning the domain of spatial organization into the focal point of your attempts to innovate and to experiment in architecture on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the possibility that a building can embody a historically significant contribution to architecture, right? There's a correspondence between those two things. And in fact, no wonder that many of the paradigm shifts in architecture, 20th century and early 21st century architecture actually happened around a foundational rethinking of the spatial organization of a building's element, right? So, for example, from Adolf Loos's round plan, which is all about that, very, very early, to Frank Lloyd Wright's innovative plant layouts and reports between a particular structure and program. And this is the unit temple, which I think to some degree is a relatively understudied project and an extremely innovative one, I think, in many ways, but of course it's Guggenheim also, it's all about that as well. To Corbusier's 5 points, but in particular the free plan and the separation between facade and structure. OMA's free section. Not only buildings, but also writings, Stanley's field conditions, which I will come back to a little bit later as well. 2 contributions in housing as well, such as early MVRDV work, both in small and larger scale, resting on a kind of imaginative 3-dimensional disposition of units. 2 topographic distributions of program in concert with surface and structure, such as FOA's Yokohama terminal, but basically most of the work they did between 97 and 2003 approximately had a lot of this kind of innovative thinking. And many of Toyo Ito's work as well. I could have brought Sendai, right, the bursting of structure into minimal elements to house services and flows, for example, or I mentioned Taichung earlier, which is based on 2 series of subspaces which are out of phase with regards to one another in such a way that they interweave both in plan and section, but never intersect. And here I brought in Tama, which is about a certain column arrangement that interacts with and basically dissolves program in a very particular way. So it's the realization of the importance of spatial organization that motivated the project for the essay after which the book is titled, Spatial Infrastructure, which is a term that started to really emerge in a series of studios I did at Columbia starting about 6 years ago. And that gave me the opportunity to really distill the term and start to see how I could craft something around this to the point that I realized that there was a kind of ensemble that's constitutive of all buildings, right? And an ensemble without which there's no building at all, that in my view needed attention and analysis, right? And this ensemble, what I mean by this ensemble is basically a three-dimensional, or let's say a material set of elements distributed in space, in 3D space, in such a way that they provide a primary articulation of the space within the envelope of a building prior to the introduction of partitions, right? So material set of elements distributed in 3D space that precede the introduction of partitions in a building, right? So that's what I mean by spatial infrastructure, right? Then, in addition to that, you have the compartmentalization scheme, right? So partitions themselves. But it turns out that the partitions themselves, you cannot really place them unless in relationship to the spatial infrastructure. Therefore, they are subordinate to the spatial infrastructure, right? And also, moreover, partitions actually can and do change often, right, across the life of a building, right? Whereas the spatial infrastructure cannot really be altered that much, right? I mean, if you alter it, then either the building collapses or the building becomes something else, right? Which is very, very rarely the case, right? So it doesn't change, really. And so it's because of this difference, both in terms of hierarchy and degree of permanence, that infrastructure in this particular sense, I think, encapsulates the spatial nature, captures the spatial nature of a building in a particularly important way relative to partitions. So the greatest number of buildings conceived and built in 2022 today are based on what we can consider to be the quintessential spatial infrastructure of the 20th century, and that's Corbusier's Maison Domino of 1914, right? Basically a series of parallel floor slabs held apart by vertical supports, right? Whether those vertical supports are columns or wall stretches or you name it, but the basic structure gravitates around this, right? Or it's reducible to this. It's reducible to this. You may have cantilevers, you may have courtyards, you may have a number of things, but the core of it is reducible to this in a very easy way. Now, against the pervasiveness of the domino scheme, of course, alternatives started to emerge, and in particular, I think around the 1950s, such as, for example, Kistler's variations on the so-called endless house, and a number of others. But in spite of these, which were few and far between, the domino scheme continued to assert itself up to today. So some of you might be saying at this point, well, what you mean by spatial infrastructure is really the load-bearing structure, right? I mean, it's the same thing. Well, the load-bearing structure certainly plays an important role in the materialization of spatial infrastructure, but it's not necessarily the same thing. Right? In some cases, they do coexist. I mean, they are actually one and the same, such as, for example, at Musac by Mansilla Tuñón in León, Spain, where those series of walls that are basically extrusions, alternative extrusions on a pattern made up of a series of basically squares and rhombi, are both the material construct providing that primary articulation space and also the load-bearing structure. They're one and the same. But in other cases, such as the Yokohama terminal again, they're not the same, right? Because the material construct providing that primary articulation space is this continuous, non-directional surface that comprises bifurcating paths and flat open areas and connecting portions and all of that, while the load-bearing structure is actually an assemblage of bidirectional discrete elements. That's to say the transversal ribs and the longitudinal girders, right? So they certainly have a lot to do with one another, and there's a certain tension between the two of them, but they are not the same, right? And that could be analyzed for every single building, right? Maybe that would be also an interesting essay in itself, I believe. So a crucial characteristic of spatial infrastructure is that it is transcendental. That is to say, it transcends the particularities of the building into which it evolves, right? In terms of program, in terms of specific volumetric outlines, in terms of colors, in terms of texture, etc. Materials. That has two important consequences, which are in a way two different ways of saying the same thing, and that is on the one hand that the same spatial infrastructure can be deployed in many different contexts without losing its identity, and that's why I put up that slide there. Those are buildings in very different styles and by very different architects, which all share the same spatial infrastructure. And also, on the other hand, the fact that the spatial infrastructure really precedes programmatic specialization, right? That is to say that the same spatial infrastructure can be occupied by different programs, right? And to illustrate that, I just put up a couple of projects here which cannot be any less neutral, that is to say, any more formally inflected and formally singular, and yet they change programs drastically, right? So this is the originally an airport terminal, the Aerosarinen TWA, which now is a hotel lobby, right? Nothing to do. And also the very well-known MBRDV, originally Hanover Pavilion, so a pavilion for an Expo 2000 Expo, that now it's on its way to becoming a co-working building, right? So the same spatial infrastructure, even when it becomes really specific, really singular, precedes programmatic specialization, right? And that brings me to the first purpose of spatial infrastructure, right? Like, why you do that? You know, what's the point of this notion? Right? Well, I like to share at least three purposes for it. So on the one hand, that a design framework constructed around spatial infrastructure encourages a certain suspension of a form to program correspondence, right? Like I just said. So if you are in that kind of mindset, that allows you to tackle, or you'll be in a better position to tackle the growing necessity for buildings to accommodate alterations, occupancy alterations relating to changes over time, right? Or basically changes of program, right? Which is a condition of 21st century architecture, much more so than before, I believe, right? That's been around for a while, but nowadays, because of sustainability and because of for a number of reasons, that's become paramount. Now, secondly, it would seem that the focal design, the focal design scenario for a project doesn't tend to be the spatial infrastructure, right? It tends to be, depending on the country you look at, depending on the culture you look at, we may speak about programs massing, for example, if you are in the Netherlands, or you can speak about certain research into materials, certain parts of Spain, Portugal, maybe Japan as well, contextual relationships, envelope and shape in the US, for example. But the spatial infrastructure as such, I think it's a relatively rare point of entry into design, which means that it would allow you to think differently about building, right? Because it would encourage, or it would channel a displacement in terms of how you think about buildings. And then thirdly, which for me is the most important purpose, is that any spatial infrastructure embodying a previously unavailable spatial organization basically grows the domain of spatial organization in architecture and with its architectural thinking at large, right? In other words, that the main raison d'être, the main purpose of this would be to say that it can serve as a heuristic device to imagine new models of spatial organization in architecture, right? That would be the main goal of this. So, fine. So for that to happen, that wouldn't be enough, right? Because so far, what I've done is basically to attempt to delineate the boundaries of a concept, basically, and to do it very quickly because I'm trying not to speak too long, but at least to give some indications as to which direction I'm trying to go in with this. Now, what needs to happen is, all right, so now we had to start to turn that into a design framework, right? So we start to slightly leave the notional domain behind and start to enter into a more kind of design-driven mentality to see what we can get out of that. So for that, what I do is I propose 10 points that, as I say, try to kind of develop the concept into a design framework. So the first thing is to differentiate between form and shape. This is a distinction that we can make in English, in German, in Greek as well, but we do not have in Romance languages like French, Italian, and Spanish, and it makes a huge difference and is super helpful. To say in this case that spatial organization belongs to form in a way that it doesn't to shape, right? When by shape, what I mean is, what I say, there's a figure, outline, external volumetric conditions, so it's something that has a particular dimensions, particular colors, perhaps, particular line, outline, whereas form is really scaleless, right? And it has an organizational nature. Now, the second point is to say that because inhabitability is a condition of spatial infrastructure, what does that mean? That means that insofar as a spatial infrastructure is meant to ultimately become a building and therefore be occupied by a collection of human or human-related activities, right? That's to say what we call a program, that a programmatic potential has to be immanent to spatial infrastructure insofar as it is architectural and not something else, right? Programmatic potential, right? That's different from programmatic specialization. It doesn't need to be maybe a particular program, but you kind of have to see that it has this programmatic potential inherent in the very nature of the spatial infrastructure. So, in other words, this notion, this construct encapsulates two principal denominators. On the one hand, the organizational aspects of form, the organizational traits of form, and on the other hand, program as its inherent content, as opposed to an a posteriori infill, right? So this is an attempt to resist the idea that you will shape something, you will formalize something, and then you will fill it up with program, right? That's very typical in many design processes, right? Here's to say, no, there's a kind of a step at the very beginning where you are already aware of this immanence, of this programmatic immanence. As a way to illustrate that, I just put up this slide where you can, I think you can make the argument that what you have on the right hand, right, the image, that's architectural form insofar as you can clearly see how to turn that into a building relatively quickly, right, without many modifications in terms of the DNA of that. Whereas on the left, you would have to modify that to such a degree that it would either become something else, or you would be basically unable to turn that into a feasible building. Therefore, that's not architectural form. Therefore, it doesn't it doesn't possess that programmatic immanence, right? The program is not its inherent content, so to speak. Because spatial infrastructure is primarily a construct gravitating around a spatial organization, there's no way you can escape what, to me, I think, and to many other people, is the most important contribution to that domain in history and theory, which is Stan Allen's field conditions, right? So with respect to Stan's framework, I certainly share the idea of operating at the edge of control. That is to say that the organizational scheme embodied in a spatial infrastructure is produced through a series of codified design moves, codified design gestures or patterns or systematic decisions, which are conceived in such a way that they can catalyze obstacles, chance, and variations as they appear, right? So that the result at the end is both coherent and yet diverse, or consistent and yet nuanced, right, at the same time, right? I wish I could elaborate more on this, but I know I'm going relatively quickly through that. We can discuss whatever you guys feel it's important at the end, of course, to delve a little deeper in some of these things. So with regards to Stan's framework, the chief contribution here would be to say, okay, fine, but in his case, most of the examples he gave and the kind of architecture that gave rise to, you can see that field conditions is developed in 2 dimensions, and then the 3rd dimension, the z-axis, really appears as an extrusion, right? So the contribution with respect to that is to say, okay, so can we deploy field conditions in 3 dimensions, right? And so to do that, which I think is completely possible, and Taichung does that actually already, we would have to deploy those conditions in terms of 2 things, right? In terms of how the local connectivity of elements, what's called part-to-part relationship or local syntax, actually produces a system or a pattern. And then secondly, with regards to the openness of that system, right? This capacity to mutate, to change, to adjust, to accommodate variations as it develops. Now, fourthly, in architecture, and as I'm sure all of you must have experienced by now, the discussions of design process and outcome are inextricably bound together. You cannot have one without the other, basically. So the idea here is the fancy term would be something like propose a critical dialecticization of those 2 terms, which is to say to separate them while keeping them in tension. And what that means is that we can actually use the design process as a critical framework to evaluate the success of the outcome, insofar as the outcome needs to collapse these dichotomies, 2 of which I mentioned earlier, consistency and nuance and all of that, but also figure and field, individual and collective, chance and loss, indeterminacy and order, right? We can use the design process as a critical framework to judge the success or to what degree our outcome actually features the collapse of those dualities, right? And then as a part of that, again, I'm not going to go into that, but we can discuss it later if you're interested. There's a crucial differentiation to be made here between design process and process design, right? Which is deployed very different depending on also the context that you teach, the context you operate in, particularly between the US and Europe. I think there's a major difference between one side or between one idea or the other, right? Beyond separation between floors, I think spatial infrastructure could be a way or a means to freeing building from its immediate identification with the uniformly stratified space of the maison dominant. So rather than some version of a vertical pile of slab, through an array of distinct configurational properties, you can actually start to imagine ways to undercut the otherwise clear-cut separation between levels, right? So here I bring an example of that, brilliant example of that, I think, which is Unit Studio Stuttgart Museum, where you can no longer tell where the levels are, right? Distinctive spatial qualities, I think because these spatial infrastructures that I'm interested in here feature a series of singular spatial attributes. They are far from being neutral, right? They're not neutral. That is to say, there's an attempt to not compromise on architectural quality in the name of flexibility, right? What does that mean? That means that historically the term infrastructure, when applies to architecture, has been used to make references to allude to a series of buildings featuring a kind of neutral shed-like space along with the machine-like aesthetic of the envelope, right? And I'm thinking of examples such as Peter Behrens' AEG factory, turbine factory, or the Pompidou Center, right? An absolutely invaluable contribution to the history of architecture in many other ways, but in this particular sense, it's essentially a stack of parallel floor slabs giving rise to empty generic spaces, right? Whereas counterexamples of that would be something like Akihisa Hirata's Gallery S project in Tokyo, where if you look at every one of those spaces individually, they're actually quite flexible, but they're organized in space in such a way that a configuration featuring a certain singularity results, right? So in other words, flexibility doesn't default in neutrality, right? There is a major tendency of that in 20th century architecture where flexibility is immediately associated with neutrality, right? So here we're trying to actually encourage the opposite in a way. Or Ishigami's kite as well. It's certainly not a neutral space, but it's super flexible, right? The disposition of columns and the way they are rotated with regards to one another, even the way they sound when you knock on them, based on whether they are in tension or in compression, encourage different kinds of appropriations around them, and still they are many, right? And yet the space that serves as a framework for all of that, as an indeed infrastructure for all of that, is far from neutral. Now, with soft zoning, here the objective is to say, all right, so rather than prompting a specific compartmentalization unequivocally, this is the layout of partitions that I have, that's it. How about spatial infrastructures that can accommodate a range of different layouts, a different array of compartmentalization schemes, out of which only one is actualized, materialized at a given point in time, right? In terms of how the areas are merged or separated, dimensioned, organized, etc., right? Let's say that in contrast to building elements that clearly differentiate themselves from the surrounding fields, such as partitions, walls, the main programmatic areas in a soft zoning regime are depending on spaces, that is, on threshold spaces, right? So spaces that can house program in addition to their connective role. So indeed spaces that connect at the same time as they separate, or that they separate by connecting, right? Now, if you start to think along those lines, then it turns out that those threshold spaces combine both a strong identity, but at the same time the limits can fluctuate, right? And further to that, they approximate the idea of region and abandon the notion of room, right? So you can organize a building based on fluctuating regions as opposed to fixed rooms, right? I think that goes along with the idea that because of this potential to change, you're actually exploiting the capacity of the spatial infrastructure in question also to accommodate a diversity of activities as they change over time. So it's basically to follow on the same logic. I think a good example of that would be the Rolex Center by Sana, where if you look closely enough at that plan, you realize that there are many instances where spatial thresholds without divisions are used to separate further spaces, right? And then beyond that the layout, the internal configuration you get there is actually just one out of many possible configurations, right? There's a kind of built-in fluidity to that and a fluctuation to the possibilities you have within that plan that I think materialize this notion of soft zoning in a very successful way. Here from architecture versus engineering to architecture engineering hybrid, as I said earlier, the load-bearing structure is different from the spatial infrastructure conceptually, but at the same time plays an important role in its materialization, of course. Between that and the fact that in addition to inhabitability, the other very important condition of spatial infrastructure is buildability, right? So maybe it doesn't get built, but when you are conceiving, managing, designing a spatial infrastructure, you have to do so that it could be built, right? Insofar as it is to become a work of architecture and not something else. So buildability is a condition of spatial infrastructure. Because of those two observations, then the study of engineering basically appears as a matter of course, right? So you cannot avoid it. So the idea with that hybrid qualifier is to say that Well, there is a specific sort of subversive disciplinarity based on what we can call twofold structural awareness. That is to say, an awareness that synthesizes, on the one hand, structure in the traditional sense of the load-bearing support, a building's load-bearing support or physical support, and then on the other hand, structure in the sense of the organizational traits of form, right? So the interesting thing here is that this twofold structural awareness can allow you to abstract properties away from the first sense of the word structure, let's say the load-bearing structure, and turn those qualities, those traits, into a generative code to produce or to imagine a structure in the second sense of the term, that is to say, in terms of the organizational properties of spatial infrastructure. Now, that shift in thinking would allow us to, I believe, to go from a situation where your structure tends to be relatively, or basically a series of neutral elements unrelated to the conception of the building, or for the most part unrelated to the conception of the building, to structure as a spatial medium, right? That's related and it's part and parcel of that conception, right? Now, that is not to say that what you obtain in the end, which could be the case, is a situation where your building is all structure, right? Like, let's say, a kind of pre-modern way of thinking, like Gothic cathedrals, for example, where the building is all structure, right? That's going to happen sometimes, like at Tama, for example, by Ito that I showed earlier. That's a building that's all structure. But in other cases, like OMA's Kunsthal, that's not the case, right? And yet you have a situation where your structure is a spatial medium, right? So you have this delirious coexistence of inclined and horizontal slabs, tilted concrete supports, and straight tree-trunk columns following different layouts, castellated beams turned 90 degrees, and X-shaped tension cables, semi-arched braces, and appear and disappear as they traverse ceiling trusses, right? So I mean, certainly, and because they are basically the basis for so-called narrative space, or in Cecil Balmont's, the engineer for this terminology, that would be a kind of episodic structure, so a structure that doesn't really follow a pattern, but basically a series of episodes that surprise you every time you enter a new space. Certainly here, the structure is a spatial medium, and yet you cannot say that the building is all structure, right? So it's a little bit more complicated than that. Other instances, successful instances where you have this spatial medium is at Prada Oyama, Bajardos de Meron, of course, where the spatial infrastructure comprises three series of elements primarily, some alternating floor slabs, the three vertical cores, and most notably these horizontal extrusions that house bits of program piercing the double high spaces that they traverse, right? I mean, this is one of the to highlight something that's not necessarily related to that directly, but this is one of the first instances, one of the few instances in the history of architecture where an ornamental pattern on an envelope gives rise to a spatial organization inside, not metaphorically or symbolically, but actually literally, right? Physically, literally, right? Because the rhomboidal horizontal extrusions arise out of the diagrid of the facade, which in turn is structure. It's a diagrid, it's structural diagrid actually. It's not just an envelope. There's very few examples of that in the history of architecture. Another interesting instance of this structural spatial medium is Nieto and Sobejano's contemporary center in Córdoba, where that deformed pattern of pentagonal and hexagonal, I think it's actually pentagonal shapes, recalls some of the ornamental motifs of traditional Islamic architecture. And that's it for that point. Now, from concealment to integration of services here, the idea is to say that the specificities of a spatial infrastructure, three-dimensional fabric actually may dictate the deployment of services and flows within, right? Which is to say that, all right, let's think of servant and served spaces a la Louis Kahn, and for that, I like to put up that drawing by Kahn himself of British castles, where you can clearly tell, the difference between servant and served spaces, So after Sendai's breakthrough with regards to that, where the servant spaces are housed, not all of them, but many of them, especially services on flows, within those structural elements. The idea with spatial infrastructure is actually pose that question again, so that these servant spaces can not only be envisioned in connection with the structure, but actually can potentially at times be the very elements articulating the building, right? So you have to think that usually in architecture, that's very rarely the case. We tend to push the servant spaces, services, and all of that to the leftover areas in the building, try to hide them, conceal them. So how about we reverse that thinking and do the exact opposite, right? I mean, that's may give us an entry point into some interesting solutions. And then last point, a given spatial infrastructure is actually stylistically non-referential, right? Because it precedes the aesthetic definition of the building, right? So because it precedes the aesthetic definition of a building, that means that a design framework around spatial infrastructure can be constructed without any direct link to a predetermined architectural vocabulary or set of aesthetic codes or specific representational references, right? I think you already saw that. I mean, that was implicit already in the discussion earlier around Maison Domino, but also, for example, with regards to that's the spatial infrastructure for Taichung Opera House by Ito. You can imagine the exact same spatial infrastructure, but materialized with just straight edges, right? No curves, straight edges, and with most of those, maybe not all of them, but with many angles being 90 degrees, right? Without changing the organizational DNA of that infrastructure, right? Now, the missing link there is the notion of topology, which I cannot go into really today, but we can discuss later. So if you understand the notion of topological equivalence, then you understand how that can be materialized in a different way without losing its DNA, right? So there's no stylistic implications at that level. So to wrap up, of course, this is a project with a personal agenda, but what I've started to realize over the past, let's say, 2 or 3 years, is that in addition to that, there's a series of, actually, what I would argue are many of the most interesting offices operating out there, whose work features not all of the traits I just described in terms of spatial infrastructure, but many of them, right? So that I think you can make the argument that there's a kind of zeitgeisty sort of aspect to spatial infrastructure, even though that wasn't originally my intention to kind of scan the horizon of contemporary production and try to determine or try to detect whether there is something there that we can discuss as specific of today, even though that should be actually one of the main tasks of an architecture critic, right? To do just that. And there's a beautiful, it's not directly related to this, but there's this beautiful roundtable discussion from, I think it's the mid-2000s, so on, featuring the October group. So Hal Foster, Yves Lambois, Rosalind Krauss, and a few others. And Rosalind Krauss, I think, says literally that. That's one of the main roles for a critic, is to actually scan the horizon of production and try to see what is it that distinguishes our contemporary production in relationship to the production from earlier times, right? I think we're left to wonder whether actually critics continue to do that, or that's something that has lost grip in that profession a little bit. So anyway, so I'm going to show here some examples of buildings which, in my view, materialize some of the aspects relating to spatial infrastructure, such as this is Bruter and Baukunst's residence and parking building project on the campus of Saclay, so on the outskirts of Paris. So-called reversible architecture, and that is because the parking section of the building has been conceived so that when the subway, the tube, hits the Saclay campus, they can actually turn the parking into further residence, into more residences, right? So that's the idea of reversible architecture for them. I think much of Karamukuo's work, Karamukuo based in Switzerland, if you're not familiar with them, here, for example, in the International Science Sports Institute in Lausanne, where relatively generic spaces are organized in space in a way that's a bit particular and generate certain interesting spatial conditions. The uber famous social housing project by Peris Toral in Cornellà, where basically a matrix of equally shaped, equally dimensioned rooms give rise to these what they call programmatically ambiguous spaces. This is social housing, not a museum or school or a fancy program like that. Another very famous project, of course, Lincoln Road by Herzog de Meuron, supposed to be, I mean, it is a parking building, but actually there's a lot of other stuff happening there, some of them scripted and others unscripted. Not far from the Bruder project that I showed earlier, Studio Myoto, also on the Saclay campus in Paris, so-called public condenser, so basically a mix of different programs and activities, different scales, different nature, and all of that within a very basic structure with very basic technology. Here, what we would have to discuss is the difference between spatial infrastructure as a notion that precedes style, that's stylistically non-referential, and the fact that some of these practices, such as Bruder, I mean the French basically, because of the inheritance of and the influence of Lacaton Vassal, actually materialize their buildings in a way that looks infrastructure, right? Even though that doesn't need to be necessarily the case, right? But this building looks infrastructure, right? In addition to performing infrastructure, right? That which is a separate thing. For example, Peso von Lürichhausen's work doesn't look that infrastructure, right? Because of the importance of this sort of raw concrete that they use. That's very typical in Chile. I think the most telling example is probably Gago House, which is, in my view, a rethinking of Adolf Loss's round plan, but in this case around spiral staircase. And lastly, Christian Keres's work. I could have put up many projects by Keres. I think he's basically at the forefront of imagining new models of spatial organization today in Europe, for sure. House with one wall in Zurich, built. Pavilion for Kingdom of Bahrain, the Expo 2020 also built. The concept for the Swiss Re headquarters in Zurich, that's unbuilt. And the parking structure in Bahrain, which is about 75% completed by now. I guess to finish with a couple of thoughts, I guess on the one hand, how many of these examples and others assimilable to the same approach really embody, put forth a new model of spatial organization and architecture versus those that actually don't, right? They perform as spatial infrastructure in many ways, but actually they do not provide this new model, they do not contribute a new model. And secondly, is this really something that we can consider to be a 21st century modality of architectural thinking, even though we have detected the connections with an earlier time, 20th century, even 19th century, even earlier. But is this a 21st century modality of architectural thinking? I guess that's something that I'm also interested in. So that's all. Thank you. And I think what we're going to do now is just to sit around the table, and we start first with responses by our contributors of today, and then continue with the discussion, and then we open it up to the public. Should we do that? Yeah? By the way, Jessica Reynolds was supposed to join us, so she would like to excuse her absence because she's not feeling well and couldn't come today. So that's why she's not there. But that's her spot. That's her presence. Presence by absence. All right, so maybe, do you want to start, James?
Sure, I'll start.
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. Maybe I'll just start by introducing myself. I'm James Kamsey. Relatively new face here at the AA. I joined the faculty this year as unit tutor for Intermediate 17. Prior to that, I've taught primarily in North America, which is where Jose and I met. So that's about myself. Oh, let me also stress that I always consider myself a practitioner and a teacher and then kind of an academic as a third role, but it's kind of the weakest of my three legs. Okay, first of all, congratulations, Jose. Great book. I really enjoyed it. You kind of hooked me right away when it's like we're going to talk, in a kind of mode, draws on the history of, Stan Allen, Robin Evans, Kenneth Frampton. These are writers that were super influential to me in my education and in my practice. When I first encountered them in the 90s, I really got the sense that they were trying to write us out of postmodernism at the time. So like trying to transition us out of the 80s, transition us out of the discussion of representation and image, and really forefronted, in different ways, but what I think is a kind of instrumentality. And here we find ourselves again. And it was interesting that until the very end, so many of the images were from work from the late 90s, the mid 2000s, and then it all seemed to kind of stop for a moment around 2010. I kind of know how hard it is to make a good building after 2010, because that's around when I first started my practice. I kind of see a lot of maybe a kind of effort on your part looking at a landscape that wasn't represented in the image, which is in the images we saw tonight, but it was kind of mired in, a kind of revival of postmodernism, we seem to be stuck on this discursive hamster wheel of constantly looking back. And maybe, the kind of return to postmodernism was a kind of predictable response to, let's say, parametricism, but let's put that aside. I really kind of appreciated the book because it's another kind of effort to write ourselves back out of a kind of moment when we get mired in discussions around image and representation and into questions of instrumentality. So that's what I really loved. I wanted to maybe say, however, and put forward three questions about, let's say, three entities that don't figure in this book so much, and maybe kind of bring them up as a way to further discussion. So the first entity I wanted to call your attention to would be people and the kind of occupants, because the moment you put forward a kind of infrastructure, the moment you structure space, you're immediately creating something with an experiential side. The moment it becomes experiential, then this kind of ordering of space begins to order groups of people, begins to kind of divvy them up. Quickly it goes from kind of personal experience, but then to a kind of social experience within space, to kind of broader political questions. And to me, I saw a kind of potential here that if we take spatial infrastructure as a kind of mode of analysis with which to regard architecture, not just kind of, let's say, capital A architecture, but the built realm more broadly, that it's actually a kind of tool for political revelation. So I love really the kind of ruminations on Toyo Ito's work about how, spatially, two bodies of people are separated by this fluid membrane. But then I think about something that exists in the world today, which is the corridor. I don't know if this word means anything to you, but essentially you imagine a housing development which is kind of divided into flats for that are sold on the market and flats that are distributed through social tenancy. And this idea that, okay, those two sets of flats should have a separate door. So immediately there's a kind of spatial infrastructure that comes there where you take a single building with a consistent program and whether it's a floor or a wall, politics enters the discussion. And it does so through architectural means. And I really saw this as kind of something that, your writing opens the door to a discussion of. The second thing I would say I was looking for was the city. And there's a kind of clarity in the way you frame your work that, spatial infrastructure, even to quote you, says, limits itself to what happens within a building envelope. But I would just ask, what about the agency of architecture beyond its envelope, right? That one could imagine, and for example, the Yokohama terminal achieves this, that the building itself casts itself as part of the open civic realm of the city, and acquires different forms of agency in that regard. And then the third, let's say, body that I'm curious about situating this writing within is just like other infrastructures, like the other infrastructures, the kind of literal infrastructures of the building, lifts, circulation. You touch on kind of mechanical systems and that sort of thing. But then also the broader infrastructures that are enabling of architecture, but also within which architecture participates and has an agency. I'm thinking, for example, global supply chain, the realm of finance, the kind of weaponization of architectural design as a kind of branding tool. So, kind of like just kind of a situation of this writing within broader senses of architecture and infrastructure more globally. So that's really my reaction.
Maybe you guys.
Yeah. Okay. So my name is Sofia Psara, and I am an architect scholar. I'm based at the Bartlett School of Architecture, and I'm the director of the PhD in Architectural History and Theory and Urban History and Theory at the Bartlett. I am really pleased to be here. I really enjoyed the book, José's book, and it's an honor to be a part of this panel and engage in the discussion. I have thought about certain things regarding the book in relation to spatial organization, spatial infrastructure, and the emphasis on the building. And I'm going to offer some ways by which these ideas can be discussed in perhaps a different kind of framework as well. So the book articulates a new concept in architecture, which is spatial infrastructure, operating both as a design tool capable of projecting architectural thinking forward and as an analytical category that shifts our understanding of the history of the field and contemporary production. And through a series of well-articulated and beautifully illustrated chapters, José Aragüez puts forward some key propositions converging to two main arguments. First, architectural thinking concerns the repository of discursive knowledge engendered through the analysis, discussion, and conceptualization of two inextricably imbricated regimes, that of the building and that of the design process leading to it. And he explained why the building, the book that preceded this book, is very fundamental in the terms of the way in which he approaches the subjects in this book. And the most central observation that surfaces across the 5 essays is that spatial organization lies at the very core of architectural thinking, and therefore an intense focus on it can enable fundamental changes in the manner buildings are devised. And this leads to the idea of spatial infrastructure, which I don't need to actually go through it because José gave us a really long and very comprehensive explanation of spatial organization. And I must say that the examples that you showed us really explained it to me much better than the images that are included in the book. So thank you for that. I think that the book is really an impressive achievement. And my purpose, though, is not to review it, but to say that it aspires to be measured against the tradition of paradigmatic shifts, which José explained, across 20th and 21st century, which include loose round plan, Le Corbusier's plan libre, Oma's free section, Stan Allen's field condition, and so on. So what I'll try to do is to actually discuss the primacy of the building and spatial infrastructure in architectural thinking, offering some thoughts and provocations through some part of one particular strand in my work. So regarding the emphasis on the building, since the elevation of architecture to a liberal art in the Renaissance, the building, drawings, and language have been the key modes for the architect's thinking. However, in architectural education and research, these things are separated into architectural design and architectural history and theory. One of the reasons for this false dichotomy is the fact that any attempt to make buildings and drawings instruments of knowledge comes across the challenge of language. So I take inspiration from a clay tablet of the Bronze Age, and I will explore the value of language in understanding the building and the strength of drawing in making the building speak of spatial, social, and experiential conditions. I won't talk about social conditions, and I'm really glad you brought them up. And I'm also glad that I'm not going to talk about them so that we don't have overlap. But I address this issue through an exploration of two types of architectural consciousness: synchronicity in drawings, showing buildings and their spatial organization as the eye can never see them, and embodied vision embedded in the building as an empirical context. So perhaps this is just touching on something that I found is perhaps missing in the book. This spatial organization gives emphasis, a lot of emphasis on the conceptual organization of space, on how architects actually put things together. But there is this other dimension that has to do with the embodied vision and how the two are in a conversation with each other. So dating from 1200 to 1300 BC, the clay tablet was found at the prehistoric palace in Pylos in southwestern Greece in 1957. And it has a script on its verso, known as Linear B, and a figure of the labyrinth on its recto. Linear B tablets were found in archaeological sites such as Knossos and Festos in Crete and Pylos and other locations in the mainland Greece. And they shed light on Messenian and Minoan societies known as the Bronze Age of civilization. Linear B was deciphered by Michael Ventris, an architect and polyglot in the 1950s who I think studied at the AA, in collaboration with the archaeologist John Chadwick. But the discovery of the tablet really generated considerable excitement among archaeologists, since the figure of the labyrinth might have provided evidence of a monument that was widely identified with the Palace of Knossos, which we see here in Crete. However, although labyrinthine in some of its parts, the palace is different from the figure. In addition, the text on the verso has no literary or architectural value, which disappointed the archaeologists, being a function at least of men and goats. It is not clear whether the figure of the labyrinth relates either to the script or to the palace. And some speculation exists that a bored scribe scratched a doodle on the tablet's surface. Yet the sophisticated drawing indicates that the scribe had imprinted a complex pattern in his mind that might have held a particular symbolism. One should note that the script was impenetrable for the majority of the population, as only an elite minority were literate in the Bronze Age. That means that the impenetrability expressed by the figure and the impenetrability of the text on the tablet might have something in common. Here is the case of a member of an elite class of palatial officials whose skill of writing meant they were entrusted with access to the accounts, the archives, and certain areas of the palace that ordinary people could not reach. The script brings together two kinds of competence: knowledge of the complex space of an authoritarian rule, and the accounting systems that keep it in power. It serves as one of the earliest European records of the intertwined fate of building, drawing, and language, serving the bookkeeping of sophisticated economies and bureaucracies that organized quasi-imperial relations in the Eastern Mediterranean. So, reaching back to the foundational origins of complex societies, the relationship between buildings, drawings, and words has not been much talked about. As Adrian Forty explains, architecture has, like all other art practices, been affected by the long-standing assumption in Western thought that experiences mediated through the senses are fundamentally incompatible with those mediated through language. José's book differs, addressing the building as a discursive entity, but the emphasis on the building and its spatial infrastructure is in contrast to the idea that architecture, in effect, is a three-part system, consisting of the building, its image, that is, drawings and photographs, and the associated discourse. So it follows that there is an interactive relationship between buildings, drawings, and language. A designed building originates in drawings and linguistic documents, such as a design brief. The classifications of spaces, contents, and people in space are preceded by classifications recorded in texts, reflecting social relations of power and the history of thought. In addition to the interactive relationship between these media, there is an analogical one going back to the 19th century, and the idea that works of architecture should be read like books, narratives, or texts. Quattremerdiko and C, for example, made this analogy between historical monuments and libraries. But this idea came under strong criticism in the 20th century after modernism asserted that buildings were to be read as autonomous works. Yet, as Forty explains, even if architecture is not language, this does not lessen the value of language for understanding architecture. Bill Hillier, for instance, has made a productive analogy between the configurational structure of space, or its spatial organization, and the syntactic and semantic structure of language. The characteristic spatial organization that defines the cultural inhabitation of space is similar to the linguistic rules we think with. These rules are non-discursive. We use them unconsciously. They form the apparatus of our thought and our social behavior. There is also a cognitive and figurative relationship with language, but we don't have time to go into this. But what matters is the realization that we need both discursive and non-discursive techniques to engage with architecture and buildings in a meaningful way. So how can we proceed? So I will discuss the work of 4 architects, and my buildings are not, the buildings I've chosen are not as complex or even as contemporary as José's. They're really small buildings. The architects are Andrea Palladio Le Corbusier, who features in José's work, Mies van der Rohe and Carlos Carpa, and 4 theorists, Rudolf Wittgauer, Colin Rowe, Robin Evans, and Kenneth Frampton, who wrote about these architects, drew and diagrammed their work. And I will argue that they all addressed architecture through a double consciousness concerning the direct perception of the building based on embodied vision on one hand, and drawings allowing us to understand how spaces and forms are held together in one grasp on the other. So, looking at Wittgauer, in an attempt to reconstruct the intellectual framework of Palladio's work, Rudolf Wittgauer dedicated the body of his writings to his architecture. And 2 sections in his book, really 2 small sections, I think probably 2.5 pages each or something like that, are based on what he called a dual method. Looking at Palladio's own Giorgio Maggiore and the Rendatore in Venice, Wittgauer drew sight lines on the plan. I don't know if you see the sight lines which are drawn on the plan, arguing that Palladio unified the nave and the centralized part by the creation of corresponding vistas. So he says that when one enters the building from the entrance, one sees the far end of the crossings, a half column coupled with a pilaster, a precise repetition of the same formation under the arch of the nave. Proceeding along the central axis, he views more and more of the further dome supports, until from a point halfway along the nave, a grouping of half columns and niches closely similar to the base at the end of the nave appears in his field of vision by means of this repetition. And by this means, Palladio created a new kind of coherence between the nave and the centralized part, thus optical devices reminiscent of the effect of a stage setting counterbalance and supersede the objective structural separation. And he did a similar analysis in Santa Maria della Salute, and where he also drew these sightlines on the plan, suggesting that the design was indebted to Palladio's principles of optical unification, determining vistas across entire spaces. So Witkauer really talks not only about the abstract, conceptual, spatial organization, but the way in which Palladio organized the optical experience in the building. And his dual method, therefore, refers to this direct observation based on embodied vision, what he calls subjective scenographic space, and the conceptual grasp of the organizing principles of architecture, what he refers to as objective mathematical space. And if we had to select some other drawing precedents, perhaps Choissy's diagrams of what one experiences moving in the Acropolis would correspond to the scenographic understanding of space, as opposed to those warm points of view of the perhaps the spatial infrastructure that we see on the right. An abstract analysis of ancient architecture, representative of Witkauer's second category, conceptual space independently of the observer. And now, Colin Rowe was taught by Witkauer at the World Book Institute, which is just around the corner from here. And he took inspiration from his diagrammatic plans of Palladio's villas in his comparison of Palladio and Le Corbusier. And he framed his discussion of Palladio's Villa Malcontenta and Le Corbusier's Villa Stein using Witkauer's dual method, the tension between the abstract compositional principles the mind knows and sees on drawings and the visual impression of the work. So he says conceptually all is clear, but sensually it is deeply perplexing. So we see the kind of tension and division that he capitalized on in order to describe the two buildings. The tradition of formal analysis that emerged from art historian Heinrich Wöfflin and came to Britain through World Book historians Fritz Saxel and Rudolf Witkauer owed a substantial debt to Immanuel Kant and his theory on the interaction between two cognitive and interdependent faculties, sensibility and knowledge, and founded on the fusion of the phenomenal and the noumenal, sensual and conceptual qualities. Kant's transcendental aesthetics were translated by these theorists into embodied sensation through direct observation of a building, a conceptual understanding through drawings. Now architects work on that, and they really find it as a very interesting means for architectural expression. Because for Witkauer and Rowe, the hinge between the two forms of knowing was a space that they filled with language. But for Palladio and Le Corbusier, it became a creative method. Palladio often disguised it in his books, but his architecture thrived on it, demonstrating a tension between the factuality of building and the ideality of concept, where concept had to bend and adapt to the contingencies of the site. On the left is the design of an ancient house, on the right a palazzo he designed in Venice, adjusted to the irregularities of the context. But everywhere in the book he doesn't really talk about these kinds of contingencies. The geometrical centrality of the void in Le Corbusier's Tokyo Museum is another instance, because it does not correspond to the rotational pattern of movement. For the Swiss architect, the hinge between the two forms of knowing becomes a semantic expression of modernity, balanced between a classical and an anti-classical composition. Coming to Robin Evans and Kenneth Frampton, no writer has understood better the limitations of drawings than Robin Evans, who saw it as being productive of a reality that ends up outside the building. And shifting attention from the abstraction of drawings to the sensory qualities of Miss van der Rohe's pavilion, Evans argued that the pavilion possesses not conceptual symmetry, independently from material contingency, but sensory symmetry, grounded on the realm of sensation. First, horizontal symmetry along the horizon as the axis of reference, and second, symmetry produced by the reflections on the polished materials that restored a coherence that was lacking from the visible surface of the building. And in response to the spatial infrastructure, Evans said, the building adheres more to the logic of appearance suppressing all associations with the rationality inherent in stresses and strains of the load-bearing structure. And now to our last theorist and architect. This anti-Cartesian idea of the corporeal imagination lies at the heart of Carlos Scarpa's work, as Kenneth Frampton explains. And quoting Marco Frascari, Frampton stresses another essential aspect in Scarpa's method, that between, in quotes, construing a particular form and constructing its realization. Being a man of Byzantium who came to Venice by way of Greece, Scarpa's work embodies this dual consciousness of a classical coherence founded in the abstraction of the spatial organization of the whole and the tectonic generative and sensual capacity of the joint to capture the evolving fabric of the built world as a peculiarly Venetian experience. So he threaded linear promenades through narrow spaces and sites, and his work in this way is a celebration not only of the joint, but also of the sensual qualities and tensions between embodied vision and movement as they are encountered in Venice. In the Castelvecchio, this tension is evidenced in the continuous unfolding journey beginning at the gate tower and continuing right into the gallery, and the sight lines sketched in both the courtyard and the sculpture gallery, including sight lines from one sculpture to the other. So in line with Evans' thought, we can propose that language is productive of a reality that, like drawing, ends up outside the building, yet the three are intertwined. And as José's preference for attending to the building in spatial organization and spatial infrastructure, to this I would add that the purpose is to develop what Bill Hillier called specifically architectural theory, rather than one that borrows and imports from other disciplines. But we have some work to do in order to get there. Our experience of buildings and drawings is non-discursive. The way in which we access spatial organization does not render itself categorizable through words in the same way in which objects or other entities do. In contrast, architecture as a larger category than building is both discursive and non-discursive, developing in three parts: the building, the drawing, and the discourse. All three, language, drawing, and building, are instruments of architectural thinking, inhabiting the hinge between the conceptual spatial organization and its perceptual mode of understanding. Thanks.
I think I'll go now. Well, thank you, most of all. I think this is great. This was also listening to the two interventions. Fortunately, I think I will add to some other kind of part of the realm of the book, so that can be nice. I'm Ana Font, by the way. I'm an architect. I studied in Spain, and then I spent almost a decade between North and South America. And now the last 4 years I've been in London studying my PhD, a year to go, so wish me luck with that. And yeah, I mean, honestly, I think book launches are amazing because it's where we can discuss something with, like we have something in common, and we already converge with that. So I'm really grateful, José, for the invitation to come today. And also, I also think that the fact of publishing a book is an act of sort of intellectual generosity. I know you spent all your summer putting this so that we can be here today, and I know it's a lot of work. So I think that should be said. We don't do that all the time, and I think you've developed a practice of publishing which mobilizes you, and I think it's a huge force. So I've been reading this the last week, and the object helps. It's a very nice object. But what captured me while I was reading were two things that I wanted to pose today on the table. First, I was seeing through, like in between the lines, a sort of story of the last 2 decades with you as a thinker, but that I think reflect something that has happened in the last 2 decades. And the second thing is a sort of recurrence on the form of your argument and some themes. So I want to propose, through these recurrences, a sort of unity of the book instead of the unity of the essays. And in a way, in a bit of a playful way, a sort of guide to read the book. Because I think that the book, you learn a lot of actual facts, like now you showed so many case studies and all, so it is something that you can actually read in different ways. But just starting with the first one, when I opened the index, it struck me. This starts in 2009. This is more or less when we met. We were studying our masters in the US, East Coast, and we didn't know that the next 20 years were going to be 20 very difficult years. We're still counting, right? So it's a sort of backlash, recession. I don't want to name it. It's been a thing. And I think that has affected architectural discourse as a medium for discussion very much, and it has reflected that in different ways. I don't know, architectural practices have atomized, positions are multiple and multiplying, and it has gone down, I would say now, to the unit of the narrative as an individual narrative. No? So we cannot go like more into the unit as that. I think that has determined your writing in a certain way. It is a writing that is kind of hyper-contextualized. You have developed a sort of way to communicate it that makes explicit what I think it's like loopholes. Like, I feel like you are very aware of everything that goes around the argument, because in a way you need to, because what you're interested in is in a sort of difficult position. So I think that has affected in a good way. I mean, affected can have a negative connotation, but I think you have become very strong in going around the argument, and I think that comes through in the book a lot. So to me, the counterpart of that wish is that you have a huge hunger for collective convergence in a way, actually, of finding the overlaps, finding the commonalities. You showed that image of the building moment where everyone was here, like, actually you are looking for the convergence, but to do so, you look at all the counterparts to that convergence. I think that is, of course, it's a good academic practice per se, so that is a fact, but I think it's also essentially the way that you work. And I think that in the essays, and because your introduction ends with this claim of urgency for architecture as form of knowledge. In a way, you put it as a sort of urgency, and I think in a couple of them, like the one in the building particularly, and the one on critique, you detect a sort of agony of that material. Like, that material is kind of agonizing in a way, the building is agonizing, and you then go for it, and you tackle it again. I think, I don't have the quote exactly, but Walter Benjamin had this idea that when something is declining, is the moment to look into it, because it is exactly when that starts to happen that the material is revolutionary again, right? So I think that to me has been, I'm looking at it and I'm like, okay, you are doing that. So that is kind of the first point that I wanted to make. Then the second one, which is it goes into the argument, is this guide. No, it's like the challenge of the unity. I think basically, if we were to go, if you read all the essays, I would say there are 5 parts to the essays. First, you break down the term, the organic, this points, the building, and you acknowledge its etymology, of course. Second, you elaborate these modalities that exist around it, and you use very specific examples and authors that are actually very commonly known. Sullivan, Gaudí, Wright, Aalto, so like almost anyone should know them, and if you don't, then you have to, right? You have to know them. You don't want to discuss them, you just need to know them. 3, you name the principles that are the friction. You say, okay, it's a problem of part to whole, it's a problem of dynamism, it's a problem of growth. You name the friction specifically. 4th, you named 2 or 3 examples that are very close to what you want, but they don't make it fully. Like, okay, Stan Allen, he's great. Like, he has the feel, but he doesn't have the 3D. Or Kenneth Frampton, the structural unit, almost there, right? But I need something else. And I think you do that. And then 5th, you claim that space. You claim that space and you say, with all this bulk of references, all of them are interesting, all of them are part of the argument, but I want to find something that is in between that constellation. So I think that is how, if you read through the essays, that is how, at least my, kind of the way I kept enjoying them. I read 1, read 2, and I think that the number counts because it's 8. So by the moment you arrive to the 6 and the 7, you start to see the pattern. And even if they can be read different, like separately, one day the other, because I read all together, it's like watching a Netflix series all together. You kind of get the whole thing, like this was made like this, right? So I suggest that you would do that. And then because of that continuous reading, there's one idea that I really like that it's in the metacriticality text, which is that Sloterdijk calls it concerns, like getting closer to certain facts. And I thought that you have first across the book 3 pairs of concerns that you keep insisting on in every essay almost. The first pair is architectural thinking is not grounded on its selfness. It doesn't refer to itself. It is permeable and it's linked to culture. The second one is because of that, it has the potential to influence outwards. So architecture, it's not only being adaptable, but it's a potential medium for influence. That goes to the second pair, which is the building, which for you is like this form plus program, and program is a very particular way to see program. It's hosting human activities, so you kind of relativize it and you don't go into typological ground. Yeah. And then the third one is that the 2 things that actually I think are very central, which is building as spatial organization versus building as representation. You are very clear about that, and I think the thing that most interests you and that leads you to a lot of the picking of the cases is the idea of spatial reciprocity, because it's crucial that there is no opposition between inside and outside. And I think, to me, there is where I am completely aligned with you in terms of what organization is. I understand organization in that way as well, as something that it doesn't have to project on the facade. It is more like finding this reciprocity. Then, for me, the idea of a spatial infrastructure, to go to the core and to the title, it is indeed, it overcomes the idea of building, I would say. I think it's something that moves forward from your proposition of building, I mean, not the building. Yeah. And I think it does it because you tone down the program part. I think the argument needs that in order to progress. That's my opinion entirely. And we can discuss why and this more, but I think that the moment you tone it down, then you kind of free yourself from certain things. And then the 10 points, which are, again, I think your architectural critical concerns, your 10 concerns, start to be a place where, because I feel aligned with the overall concept, then I find more nuances. I feel like I understand certain concepts in a different way, that is not that direct, that maybe it's more contested territory. So I think that it is a very interesting place, because you showed at the end all these new case studies. Maybe I will hold part of this comment. To me, there is one thing which is, looking at today, I think that was very nice. So I'm thinking of it, you just presented it, so maybe that's the way to go. Like, interpel the 10 concerns through these case studies that are from today. That could be an interesting thing to do. The other thing was, I was wondering what happened with your studios at Columbia, because you said you started this. So it's like, what happened with this testing? Is there something to speak about there? And then lastly, and just this because I feel like also when you started using words that to me are important because they imply certain modes of practice like consistency, differentiation, variation. You kind of circle around a certain part of architectural production that I think you have attached to a very particular place in history. And I don't know, if we were to have a kind of informal chat, I would kind of try to push you into that, like why, you know, like I think it's very American context to avoid American formalism in a certain way. And I think because you are very careful, you don't kind of step into the cliches, but then I think there is something there because you are starting to kind of inquire in a field that has been actually very much explored in that way, but that would be maybe an alternative, like either looking at the today or either looking at the realms that have already done it, but maybe you have been more reluctant to kind of engage with in the past.
Yeah.
You have 3 problems.
And I would really like to hear from the audience as well. I mean, I'll try to be as concise as possible, cross-reference the responses so that my reaction can be short. Thank you very much to all 3, first of all, for the extremely thoughtful responses. in a way, Anna replied partially to James a little bit, less so to Sophia, but a little bit as well when she said that the program part is toned down, right? So the question of one can only do so much in 170 pages, right? Analysis. And I feel like many of the questions that especially Sophia and James brought up would start other projects off of this, right? So I was really interested to hear that, to maybe develop that in the future, right? And see, maybe we can push it further in that direction or that other direction, right? So for example, yes, right, the whole phenomenology aspect, the experiential aspect of architecture is less present than other aspects of architecture. So the whole question of embodied vision and all that, which belongs in that experiential domain, is you could say played down. I mean, it does feature in some of the essays, but less so or nothing in the spatial infrastructure essay. The reason being not because I'm not interested, I'm extremely interested in that, but since this deals with the thing that needs to be there in order for it to be perceived or experienced, that demands already a lot of work to even try to, to work through that, even before we started talking about how you experience it, right? So I stopped there, right? I stopped at the level where you already, okay, fine,
just
that's infrastructure.
I don't think that I try to stress phenomenology. I think that optical experience has a structure as well, yeah? So it's
which
just
also, philosophers in phenomenology have talked about that, about the structure of perception, all of that, right? And that belongs in a certain, we don't really have the time, I think, to go into that in depth, but indeed, right? And part of the whole discussion on language partially intersects that, not entirely, but partially intersects that. So yes, right? So that's the subject issue goes partly into that, and then partly into the way space is used programmatically, right? Which does feature, for example, in the sponge territory essay, because that's basically 60% of that essay is about that. But it's true that in the central essay, that's not, it's played down a bit, except for the fact that conceptually, I do speak about this programmatic immanence to acknowledge that basically architecture is social by definition, because the minute you have to house a collection of human or human-related activities, then it becomes social by definition, right? So then we can go into discussing how these subjects relate to one another, and then to institutions and to social structures outside of that and all that. But again, I'm trying to actually narrow down the discussion as much as I can to make sure that I make at least one or two clear contributions to what I'm trying to say here. So I do feel that much of that will start to push us out of that, and not to say that's less important, but again, trying to kind of restrain myself to the domain where I'm trying to contribute to. The same applies to the city, right? Somebody the other day mentioned that, hey, why don't you do the same thing but on the city? Just keep the title and do a spatial infrastructure project in the city, right? And that's so true, right? I think philosophically speaking, before I say this notion is restricted to that which happens within a building's envelope, it can also operate at the urban scale as well, right? For sure. And maybe in the future I'll do that. That would be, I think, fascinating to do, right? But again, it would exceed the limits of this, right? The same with politics and everything else. So because I'm trying to be very, very short, I'm not doing justice to your responses at all, but I'm trying to just be very brief. I'm also going to touch on some things that Anna mentioned. Yes, I really liked what you said about certain things, detecting certain things that are missing in Frampton's notions, understand, and all of that. So the confession here, of course, is that I train in philosophy very, very heavily. And philosophers, because of the particular tradition or connection with science in the past and all that, and also for other reasons, operate like that. That is, they scan the history of a particular notion or a particular argument, and then once they detect what's missing, that's where they say that's an issue of opportunity. That's where I can insert my thinking, right? So you can see that kind of methodology here throughout the book, I think. The issue of American formalism, which is connected to this question of trying to focus on architectural thinking as something specific, but also trying to go outside and all of that. I didn't mention that today, but throughout the whole The Building project, one of the main points in my presentation was to differentiate between specificity and autonomy, right? So whereas the American context, and in particular the tradition of formalism, is all about this autonomy, this kind of itselfness that's not permeable to other domains, not only of knowledge and practice, but even within architecture. I would resist that and say that architecture is basically specific by definition, but not autonomous, right? So, and because of the also connection with Clement Greenberg in the US, which is so important, in the US, there's a tendency to overlap these two terms, right? Because of the medium specificity notion of Clement Greenberg, that's immediately associated with autonomy. So wait a second, autonomy and specificity are two different things. So because architecture is not autonomous, then we can think about projecting outward. So that's why I also consciously not address the question of formalism as such, because I'm actually fundamentally against it. And also because even more philosophically, I think formalism in architecture is basically an impossibility, insofar that for a form to be architectural, it has to have program as inherent content, and the minute there's a content to form, then you're no longer talking about formalism in the philosophical sense. Therefore, formalism is basically a rhetorical word. It's no longer something that describes the reality of things, I believe. And then lastly, if I ever could share some of the work we did in those studios at Columbia, as modestly as I can, I do think the students made some discoveries in terms of new models of spatial organization in architecture. We were very careful to look at certain traditions, push those, or try to detect those niches of opportunity and all of that. And the part that we were discussing earlier in terms of the subject, phenomenology, and all of that, that was also developed there as part of the design process, right? So we could, for example, have debates as to how your perception of a sequence of spaces can relate or not relate to the mathematical geometric definition of a spatial infrastructure based on how you materialize it. I mean, the kinds of things that would require not a 170-page book, but a 400-page book. In studio, you actually had to do it because you had to train students to do that. So you could see that tension play out there in a number of interesting ways. So I think we could say a lot more, but maybe we can ask the audience, or what's left of the audience. I realize we've been here for almost 2 hours now, which is great. I think that's testament to everything we have to say. But we'd be really grateful to maybe take some questions or comments. Or yeah, go ahead.
What's the difference between an architectural diagram and a spatial infrastructure?
Let me put it this way. So I think, so there's a whole history to the notion of diagram and all of that, right? A diagram, to me, is a representation. The best type of diagram you can possibly find in architecture is a representation of an architectural concept. Which of all of the diagrams that you find, that's a relatively small proportion, because an architectural concept, I think, is relatively rare to find, a concept as such, not a representation of circulation or a representation of something else, right? Even when that's the case, it remains a representation, right? Whereas spatial infrastructure is not a representation. It's the being of a building, right? Again, resorting to these more philosophical terms, right? So you can use a diagram to represent the concept embodied, the architectural concept, not philosophical, literary, musical, and all of that, but the architectural concept embodied in a spatial infrastructure. You can use a diagram for that. And in fact, you need to use a diagram to show it, because it's the tool we have in architecture to abstract the thing that we want to express as an architectural concept, right? So that already gives you the difference, I think, right, between that which is, right, the spatial infrastructure itself, and the thing, the graphic tool that we use to represent the architectural concept that's embodied in a spatial infrastructure, in cases where you actually have a conceptual spatial infrastructure, which would be, I think, also a way to extend the lectures, because not all spatial infrastructures are conceptual, in my opinion, precisely because it's difficult to come across an architectural concept. I think, something that I stress often, and that would be maybe another project, is that there's a difference between what we call a partie, a layout, a design strategy, a composition. There's a difference between all of that and an actual concept, such that there's very, very few buildings, in my opinion, that actually embody a concept. Like Sendai, for example, is a conceptual building, right? Which you will represent through a diagram. Musak is a conceptual project as well, right? Seattle, definitely a conceptual project.
Montreal 67.
Definitely a conceptual project. Right? Walden 7. I never thought of that one. Maybe, yeah. Actually, I think you're right. Yeah.
Keep it going, Tony.
Yeah, keep it going. Right? And so just last word, so that's very important, right? What we push the discussion to, because when you use the term conceptual in architecture, oftentimes that's understood as undefined or not defined enough, right? Oh, but that's just a conceptual proposal. It's not developed, right? And I'm like, no, wait a second. That's just undeveloped. That doesn't mean it's conceptual, right? I mean, you can have a building built since 1960 and for that to be a conceptual work of architecture, right? It's a different thing. It doesn't mean undeveloped, right? It's like specificity and autonomy, right? Conceptual doesn't mean undeveloped. It means that it embodies a concept, right? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't have a question. I just have an observation. I just thought it was really interesting, and I have not read your book, and I'm not going to base the content based on listening, because I think it's something that you need to read properly to understand. But it just struck me in the end of your presentation. You talked about the role of a critic, like you said. It's like collecting in a way, or curating, or bringing together a certain zeitgeisty sort of.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't help but think about the foreword of International Style of the book. Because I think Philip Johnson actually describes what he was doing in a very similar way. And then when Anna was talking about the way that you were, the way she read the argument, the way you put it just reminded me of the method. So I mean, I'm not saying that's what you did, but it was there was a certain sort of parallel in a way of this sort of thing that you were trying to do, which is almost see something, and maybe it's there, maybe it's not there, but it's definitely something that will possibly shape other people's way of looking. But you know what I mean? There's a certain project over there, but it is a project. It's an individual project rather than That's all. It just struck me about that moment. For good or for bad, I'm not judging it.
So I think there are two different things there, right? And that's, I mean, I just went very quickly through it when I spoke, but there's a difference between putting a notion out there that could possibly, as you say, well, I don't know, shape other people's thinking. All of that sounds a little too ambitious, but at least for other people to use in some way, or to be useful for some other people in some way, whether it is in history theory or in design. And as I said, that was the original intention with this, right? I think I just hit something that I mean, this is the result of so many conversations, right? I mean, this is by professors, colleagues, friends, and all of that. And something as simple as the spatial infrastructure of a building that perhaps, and I'm willing to hear maybe alternatives, but just nobody has picked up on that before, even though it's such a simple thing, really. I mean, it's such a simple ensemble of a building, really, right? This spatial skeleton. I thought, well, maybe there's something here. We had to, push it and see what we can get out of it. So that's the personal agenda side of the project. But then only later, actually, and that's I think I don't know if what you mean is actually those two sides were actually also there in the international style forward. But only later did I realize actually that there's something going on that has a little bit to do with this as well, right? And actually a lot to do with this as well, I would argue. That's why I put up those 10 last examples of contemporary architecture. So psychologically, that makes one wonder whether what you thought something you thought you were doing for some reason actually had other reasons also behind it, which you were not really aware of, and it was a kind of unconscious perception at the time of what was starting to develop that I wasn't able to verbalize or to distinguish. And only later did I realize, oh, wait a second, okay, so now probably maybe that also intersected part of this otherwise completely personal project. So I think in a way that was I like to see it as a kind of happy finding, but indeed maybe it just wasn't acknowledged earlier, but it did play a role when I started looking into this. Yeah. I mean, there's more to it, but yeah. Nice, maybe, yep.
There was a comment made about like the city. I was just wondering, because spatial infrastructure is a concept mainly associated with the interior of the building and the experiential quality. However, do you agree or believe that the concept can be translated into like the exterior city? Or like, is there a relationship between the spatial infrastructure inside the building and the outside space?
Yeah, so that's two questions, right? I think in terms of the usefulness of this notion for the urban scale, very much so, right? I mean, that's what I was trying to tell James, or I mean, he identified it already, right? And there's definitely something there, and already a couple of people have identified that. You just have to remove this restriction to the inside of an envelope and then stick with the idea that there is this set of material elements distributed in 3D, which become meaningful because they embody what, right? When we talk about the city. That's not, that second part cannot be the same, right? Because it refers to the architectural scale. So that's what we had to be elaborated on, right? And sought out. But the first part, which is basically 80% of it, would remain the same, right? And certainly, and then we had to study the tradition of urban design thinking behind that, right? So Italian morphologists, perhaps, the Dutch, the British. I mean, there's a number of people there who worked a little bit around something like that, and then, like Anna was saying, trying to spot for the niches of opportunity, start to see whether there are consistencies, inconsistencies, and then off of that, begin to develop your conceptual domain, right? And then distill a word or distill a notion, right? So that has some work, but the DNA of it can be applied to any scale, right? As I said, form as opposed to shape is scaleless, really, in the strict sense of the term. So it can be applied to anything, I mean, to a chair, right? Now, in terms of the second part of your question, or your second question, for sure, the conception of any spatial infrastructure is impacted by the outside of the building. So, in a way, that I think relates a little bit to what Sophia was saying in terms of perception, but not only perception, but also the fact that the description or the comprehension of a spatial infrastructure is not only limited to what you can describe through either strictly discursive thinking or geometry or mathematics or spatial relationships, right? But there's more to it. And I think to answer your question properly, we would have to kind of jump into that domain where, for example, views out of a building or the height of a building next door or the density of a certain block, for example, would and should impact the way you shape your spatial infrastructure. Now, part of the argument here is that the DNA of that spatial infrastructure, strictly speaking, is independent of that. Actually, it's as you know, philosophers, it's a priori. Really, it's independent of that. Actually, and then the way that starts to be modified, the way you start to fine-tune it, the way you start to actually design it and turn it into a fully fledged navigation device with facade, with materials, texture, and all of that, then would have to factor that in order to be considered a fully fledged work of architecture. But the DNA of it, it's like the Maison Domino, right? Maison Domino is what it is, right? It doesn't matter whether it's looking north, south, or whatever it is, right? It's just a stack of parallel floors held apart by held apart by vertical support. So it can be described like that and just that, and then everything else comes out. So that comes in, but then it belongs to this other phase of development. So that's, yeah.
In fact, Maison Domino was conceived by Le Corbusier in a way that it could be actually replicated to produce housing projects. That was his really big vision. But he managed to convince only one developer, and they built Pessac. Yeah, that was the only case.
And then 100 years later, actually a lot of other people, because there's a certain knowledge embedded in the Maison Domino that has to do with the kinds of materials that were used, with the kind of structural know-how and logic and all of that, that everybody started to find extremely practical and useful, right? So it started multiplied everywhere, right? There's also economy of means. I mean, there's a lot of things that were so brilliant. It's brilliant for many, many reasons. And by the way, that's not, it's like, yeah, it happens in many other fields as well. I mean, the Maison Domino, we ascribe it to Le Corbusier. Yes, he put the name. Yes, he captured that knowledge in one particular construct, but there were a lot of other things happening around that time that basically allowed him to, to do that. Like concrete and all of that, right? So, but yeah, he kind of encapsulated that. But anyway, yeah. So that's also to say that, to properly also discuss that, you kind of had to acknowledge all of this. But again, you're trying to, there's a length issue. You have to communicate things in a certain way. You have to be aware of, I guess, aware of the things you are not discussing at length, but are there nonetheless, right?
Yeah. I can just ask maybe
of course.
A few questions. How then would you represent, or which medium, jumping from your question, but in the other sense, how would you represent spatial infrastructure? Would you use like diagram, plans, like what then, how do you represent it so you can also transmit it? Or maybe language, because you're talking about elements that are not flexible and we don't really know what it is, and there's movement also, which represent the diagram, but we don't have then the specificity of the thing. So.
That's a very good question. I think at some point in the book I mentioned that you can use plans and sections, but that's only going to give you X-rays of a spatial infrastructure. But because of this emphasis on three-dimensionality, you are much better off using three-dimensional drawings like axonometrics and like cutaway drawings and all of that, right? To really capture the nature of the intricacy of spatial infrastructure, right? So it would have to be that kind of drawing, right? For example, I showed, when I talked about point number 2, and I showed these two, non-architectural form and architectural form, that kind of abstract drawing in the sense of, in this case, undeveloped, but at the same time precise enough that I can tell what the nature of the spatial organization is, right? So if you bring it back to the level of a diagram, that's not going to give you enough information on that. So it has to be that level of precision already, even though it's just basically like a building in embryo before you start to, define it further with everything that I mentioned to her with regards to the previous question. Now, again, to me, the diagram as a diagram, can represent many, many things, right? The diagrams that I am personally more interested in, because they are not only descriptive, but actually more meaningful than just descriptive, is those that capture a concept. By definition, a concept is not something that's developed, right? It's something that precedes the development of a reality, of a realization, and therefore diagram cannot really be a faithful representation of an architectural reality to the degree that the spatial infrastructure in this case would demand. So the same way that this construct, spatial infrastructure, attempts a sort of collapse of the dichotomy between form and program at core, which I didn't explain that way, but actually at core that's what it is, insofar as what's organized in space is simultaneously those material elements and the collection of human activities that are housed in relationship to those physical elements, right? So material elements. Therefore, the minute you use this spatial organizational concept, you are basically alluding to both at the same time, right? Similarly, with this notion of building in embryo, there's an attempt to be in between this diagrammatic phase, which is undeveloped on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the actually fully fledged developed building, right? So it's this middle point in between where you capture this abstraction, this abstract moment in your design process, which nonetheless already has an identifiable DNA that allows you to determine whether there's something promising in terms of contributing a new model of spatial organization in architecture. Or it's this middle point.
I actually thought the Christian Kara's models were quite interesting because so many of those models do what your text describes, right? They show structure without partition. They imply envelope, but don't actualize the envelope. And yeah, they kind of reveal us a systematic approach that's kind of organizing the building rather than, you know, a kind of image as a result. And so, yeah.
Sorry, I forgot that. James is absolutely crucial, right? To the last question, models also. Models, yes. Yeah. I mean, we've talked about, all of us, I think, up to this point about drawings, but models, right? Of course.
Because the last one you show saying that Keres is maybe the embody the most, let's say, this concept, and you show only pictures of models.
Yeah. It's a very, very good point. Yeah. Models for sure. Yeah. Not the kind of model that you would present to a developer, right? So, but yeah.
But it's also that photograph of the OMA Cesium model, which, you know, like, I think probably first appeared in SML XL. Like, that model, that photograph of that model was kind of so powerful that it launched the next 10 years. It launched MVRD FOA. You know, and I think it goes on to Keres. You know, it's like, it was like so powerful of a kind of thinking.
Yeah, that's the degree of inventiveness that OMA was capable of producing in that time between 86, 87, right, and 92, 93 especially. Yeah. Of course.
Or maybe it's a proposition rather than a question. What James was highlighting with this social aspect. And I think it is something interesting about, you know, the legacy of Thomas Salin, this like new wave of hipster architecture of Muto and Ruder, of taking spatial infrastructure as a vehicle for aesthetics almost, and at the same time embodying the social aspect. This is what like Thomas Salin is about, right? So maybe there is something about embracing spatial infrastructure also as a vehicle of social change, with the absence of the clutter or the rest of the thing. So the connection might not be as explicit, but perhaps it is underlying somewhere there.
Yeah. Absolutely. You know, one of the really beautiful things about doing these talks is that you start to see certain overlaps between comments, right, across different countries and all of that. And you are already the second person to mention something along those lines. That is to say, yes, I focus primarily, not only, but 90% on examples which are, you know, interesting architecture, more or less fancy and all of that. I did show, though, Peristoral, which is social housing, and also MVRDB housing projects, although MVRDB did those projects under very specific conditions, so it kind of doesn't count in a way. But yes, there's something built into this that could be applicable, I think, in interesting ways for projects that are not necessarily so fancy, right? And you've detected one very clear way of pushing that. I think there's also something to the reproducibility that's implicit in this notion that could be used for, you know, like the kinds of housing projects, for example, that James was talking about earlier as well. I mean, isn't housing about that primarily, right? About, I mean, exactly as James put it, right? About arranging these boundaries, right, in 3D and seeing how that, it's just that's the part that, again, right? I mean, you can only do so much, but that's the part that if you push it, I mean, you can basically do a series of studios on that. You know, to use this notion and see how we're going to try to push that in that direction and see what we can get out of it. And for that, you have to study,
certain social impact of what you're doing. But what I would say in that case is try to do it, but don't get lost. I mean, try to stick to the impact, not only the impact of the architecture in the social realm, but also on how your architectural gestures have a direct impact on the inhabitants that are going to use your building within the envelope, right? So because there are two scales there to be addressed. One is the social domain in its full scope. Let's say, let's do some of that for those of us with PhDs, whatever, that's extremely interesting by default, right? But also look person to person, from apartment to apartment, from corridor to little room here, because if not, at the end of the day, what happens often is, okay, let's bring in the social issue, and then you kind of get lost in these other kind of bigger questions, and then your architecture doesn't really contribute that much, So to put it bluntly, let's try to balance out those two scales, right? And that would be, I think, a fascinating project indeed. Or, what about a hospital, for example? No? Hospital, lends itself to this, I think, pretty interestingly. No? Yep.
Sorry to end this, but I just want to shift the conversation we had selling the books in the back, so just to give an opportunity, and also there's food and drink that is being offered, and so if they want to just kind of move the conversation, continue it, but move it into maybe to give opportunities to buy the books and whether the food and drink
absolutely
being prepared. But thank you so much. It's really been an engaging conversation, obviously.
Yeah, let's move it on to that. Thank you.